The rain did not fall in the city that night. It punished. Heavy drops hammered against the corrugated steel roof of the shipping warehouse, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the pounding inside Elias's skull. He stood near the loading bay, a silhouette carved out of pure exhaustion. Rainwater dripped from the frayed brim of his cap, cutting clean tracks through the grease and soot smeared across his cheeks. He hoisted the final wooden crate. The muscles in his forearms coiled thick veins pushing against his skin. Splinters bit into his calloused palms, but he offered no flinch. Pain was a familiar tenant in his body. It paid the rent. It kept the lights on. Most importantly, it bought the pale pink liquid sitting in the pharmacy bag tucked inside his jacket. Lily's cough had worsened. The rasping sound echoed in his mind, drowning out the roar of the diesel engines idling in the yard. She was 5. Her world consisted of crayons, a one-eared stuffed rabbit named Barnaby, and him. Just him. He had spent 8 hours under the belly of a rusted Ford at the auto shop, tasting engine oil and inhaling exhaust. When the sun dipped below the skyline, he traded his grease-stained coveralls for a high-vis vest at the docks. 2 jobs, 14 hours a day. The math of survival was brutal, but Elias never questioned the equation. The warehouse foreman, a burly man with a permanent scowl, barked the end of the shift. Elias nodded, wiping his brow with the back of a bruised hand. He clocked out the sharp metallic punch of the machine, signaling a brief reprieve. Stepping out into the downpour, the cold swallowed him whole. His boots, worn thin at the soles, hit the puddles with heavy, deliberate thuds. The streetlights flickered, casting long, fractured shadows across the wet pavement. He hugged his arms across his chest, shielding the paper bag beneath his coat. The medicine was fragile. His resolve was not. He needed to get back to the small, drafty apartment on the east side. The babysitter, Mrs. Higgins, charged by the hour, and he was already running late. Every minute ticking past midnight gnawed at his meager wages. A gust of wind tore through the avenue, carrying the bitter chill of the harbor. Elias squinted against the onslaught. His vision blurred the edges of the world, softening into streaks of neon and gray. The fatigue he had kept at bay for hours finally broke through the barricades. His knees threatened to buckle. The concrete sidewalk felt like a treadmill moving in reverse. He dragged a hand across his face, trying to scrub the lethargy from his eyes. He needed a ride. The bus line had stopped running an hour ago. Walking would take 40 minutes, 40 minutes of freezing rain. 40 minutes of Mrs. Higgins tapping her watch, 40 minutes. Lily would spend coughing into her pillow. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked, a spider web of shattered glass that distorted the display. He tapped the rideshare app. The estimated fare made his jaw tighten. $22. That was tomorrow's grocery money. It was the difference between a hot meal and another dinner of instant noodles. He hesitated. His thumb hovered over the glowing screen. Then a memory surfaced. Lily's tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb, her feverish forehead resting against his neck. The heat radiating from her small body. He pressed confirm. The app promised a black sedan in 3 minutes. Elias stood at the curb, water seeping through his jacket, pooling in his boots. The wind howled, rattling the street signs. He lowered his head, breathing in the scent of wet asphalt and decay. A pair of headlights cut through the deluge. The bright beam sliced across the darkness, blinding him momentarily. A sleek black vehicle glided toward the curb, its tires hissing against the flooded street. It was long polished, a fortress of steel and tinted glass. The rain seemed to slide off its surface with a kind of reverence. Elias blinked, his mind operating on a heavy delay. The app had said a black car. Here was a black car. Logic, battered by sleep deprivation, drew a straight line between the 2 points. He stepped forward, his legs moving on pure instinct. The cold had numbed his fingers, making the simple act of reaching for the door handle a monumental task. He stared at the glossy surface of the door. The reflection staring back at him belonged to a stranger. Hollowed cheeks, dark circles carving deep trenches under his eyes. wet hair plastered to a forehead lined with premature worry. He was 28, but the mirror insisted on 40. The weight of his responsibilities had anchored him to the earth, compressing his youth into dust. His breath plumed in the freezing air, creating brief clouds that the wind snatched away. He tightened his grip around the hidden pharmacy bag. Inside that crinkled paper lay the only thing that mattered tonight. Not his aching spine, not the damp cold creeping into his bones. Just the promise of quieting his daughter's ragged breath. The rain intensified, drumming a frantic beat on the roof of the idling vehicle. Elias swayed slightly on his feet. The world tilted the streetlights, stretching into long ribbons of gold and crimson. He needed to sit down. He needed the warmth of the heater. He needed the scent of stale air freshener and the hum of the engine taking him home. With a heavy mechanical motion, he curled his raw, grease-stained fingers around the sleek silver handle of the rear door. It felt heavy, substantial, unlike the flimsy plastic of the cars he usually repaired. But his exhausted brain failed to register the discrepancy. The latch clicked, a solid, expensive sound that was completely lost on the man who was half asleep on his feet. He pulled the door open, ready to collapse into the back seat, unaware that he was stepping out of his grueling reality and straight into the orbit of a world he was never meant to touch. Evelyn Vance operated in a world of polished surfaces and sharpened knives. The back seat of her custom Maybach was a sanctuary built of silence and reinforced steel. The air inside smelled faintly of bergamot and expensive leather, a climate-controlled vacuum designed to keep the chaotic city at a comfortable distance. She rested her temple against the cool glass, watching the rain blur the neon lights of the financial district into smeared ribbons of color. The echoes of the board meeting still rang in her ears. Men in bespoke suits, questioning her margins, probing for a weakness, waiting for the Ice Queen to crack. Richard's patronizing smile hung in her memory, a predatory smirk, masked as professional concern. She had spent the last 6 hours holding her ground, matching their aggression with cold, calculating precision. The fatigue she carried was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It did not ache in the muscles. It settled deep in the bones, a chronic weariness of the soul. She closed her eyes, seeking a fraction of peace in the quiet hum of the engine, waiting for her driver to pull away from the curb. The heavy thunk of the door latch shattered the stillness. A fierce gust of wind drove freezing rain into the pristine interior. The smell of ozone-wet asphalt and stale motor oil invaded the bergamot-scented air. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. Her posture went rigid, instincts, honed by years of corporate warfare, flaring to life. Her hand moved toward the intercom button, ready to alert Marcus in the driver's seat. A figure collapsed onto the leather upholstery. He did not look at her. He did not seem to register the expansive, luxurious cabin. He simply fell inward, a structure collapsing under its own weight. The heavy door pulled shut, cutting off the howl of the storm and sealing the two of them in the dim, soundproofed space. Evelyn froze. Her thumb rested a millimeter above the call button. She held her breath, analyzing the threat. The man sagged against the opposite door, his chin dropping to his chest. Rainwater dripped from the brim of a faded canvas cap, splattering onto the pristine floor mats. His jacket, a canvas monstrosity stained with dark patches of grease, clung to his broad shoulders. He shivered a deep, involuntary tremor that shook his entire frame. East 82nd, a voice rasped. It was gravelly scraped raw by exhaustion. The brick building by the deli, please. Evelyn remained silent, pressed against the plush armrest. The streetlights sweeping through the tinted windows illuminated his face in brief, jagged flashes. She saw a jawline dark with stubble cheekbones hollowed out by skipped meals and deep bruised shadows beneath his closed eyelids. This was not an assassin. This was not a corporate spy. This was a man who had simply run out of gravity. He let out a long, ragged exhale, shifting his weight. As he moved, his oversized jacket parted slightly. Evelyn's gaze tracked the motion. He cradled something against his ribs, shielding it from the dampness of his own clothes. It was a crumpled paper pharmacy bag. His hands rested over the bag. They caught her attention and held it. The knuckles were split, the skin raw and red-laced with fine black lines of deeply embedded engine grime. A fresh cut angled across his thumb, hastily wrapped in a piece of electrical tape. They were the hands of a machine built for endurance, yet they held the small paper bag with an agonizing, desperate gentleness. "Just drive," he mumbled, his head rolling against the glass. The words slurred heavy with the pull of unconsciousness. "Tell Mrs. Higgins. I have the cash. Just need to give Lily the syrup. 5 minutes." His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm. He was asleep. Completely, utterly asleep, surrendered to the motion of a vehicle he believed was a cheap rideshare. Evelyn withdrew her hand from the intercom. The silence in the car stretched thick and complex. The city moved past them, a silent movie playing beyond the glass, but her focus remained anchored on the intruder. She examined the puddle of water gathering around his worn work boots. The leather of her seats was imported flawless, treated to repel stains. His boots were held together by fraying laces and stubborn resolve. The contrast was jarring. Evelyn wore a silk blouse that cost more than a month of his labor. She wore armor woven from status and wealth. He wore the literal grime of his existence. A sharp cough rattled in his chest, breaking his rhythm of sleep for a fraction of a second. He flinched, his brow furrowing in a grimace of pain, his arms tightening instinctively around the pharmacy bag. Even in unconsciousness, his priority remained locked in place. He was guarding something precious. Evelyn felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in her throat. She had built an empire by breaking down competitors, by finding the crack in the armor and exploiting it. She knew how to read men. She knew the arrogant ones, the greedy ones, the calculating ones who would sell their souls for a seat at her table. But she did not know how to read this. There was no greed here, only a quiet, agonizing sacrifice that radiated from his exhausted frame. Marcus's voice crackled through the intercom, low and hesitant. "Miss Vance," a sensor indicated the rear door opened. "Is everything secure?" Evelyn looked at the muddy boots staining her custom mats. She looked at the taped thumb pressing protectively against the medicine bag. She thought of Richard, of the sterile boardroom, of the endless empty calculations of her daily life. She pressed the response button. "Everything is fine, Marcus." "Our destination, ma'am, my home." Evelyn watched a droplet of water fall from the man's chin, hitting the leather seat. She listened to the steady, exhausted rhythm of his breathing. A microscopic crack formed in her icy exterior. "No," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the hum of the tires. "East 82nd, the brick building by the deli. Drive smoothly, Marcus." The Maybach devoured the miles of wet asphalt, a silent phantom gliding through the neon-soaked veins of the city. Inside the cabin, the tension held a physical weight. Evelyn sat perfectly still. She possessed a reputation forged in corporate blood, the shark who never slept, the executive who dismantled legacy companies before her morning espresso. Men feared her silence. They crumbled under her unblinking gaze. Yet at this moment, her gaze remained fixed on a stranger who snored softly against her imported leather. The streetlights washed over his face in rhythmic intervals. Orange, yellow, gray. With every passing glow, new details etched themselves into her mind. The deep lines bracketing his mouth spoke of 1,000 unspoken worries. The grease stain deep into his pores mapped a life built on manual labor. He shifted in his sleep. His head rolled toward the window, pulling his heavy, soaked jacket wider. A splash of color caught her eye. Tucked securely beneath his left arm, nestled right against his ribs, alongside the pharmacy bag, was a small object. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, the silk of her blouse whispering against the leather seat. Her sharp eyes, trained to spot microscopic errors in financial reports, recognized the shape. It was a doll. Not the porcelain kind with glassy eyes, nor the expensive branded plastic figures that line the shelves of high-end toy stores. This was a crude, lopsided creation, knitted from cheap pink yarn. One of its button eyes hung by a single frayed thread. Its floppy ears bore the dark stains of countless sticky fingers and tight hugs. It was a grotesque little thing. It was a masterpiece of devotion. Evelyn stared at the knitted rabbit. She thought of the board members she had left behind. Men who bought affection with trust funds and compensated for their absence with black cards. Men like Richard, who equated value with price tags, who wore tailored suits as armor to hide their inherent emptiness. This man, smelling of exhaust and stale rain, held a $5 bottle of cough syrup and a ragged yarn doll like they were the crown jewels of an empire. A strange sensation fluttered in her chest. It felt like a crack forming in thick ice. She swallowed her throat, uncharacteristically dry. She did not know his name. She did not know his story. But the calluses on his hands and the protective curve of his spine told a truth more profound than any boardroom pitch. He was a father. A father stretched to his limit, running on fumes, fighting a war in the dark to keep a small world spinning. She observed the way his knuckles, even in the slackness of sleep, maintained a possessive grip on the collar of his jacket, ensuring the cold air did not touch the hidden treasures within. The electrical tape on his thumb was peeling at the edges, revealing a sliver of raw red skin underneath. Evelyn had never known labor like that. Her battles were fought with fountain pens and sharp words, her wounds invisible psychological scars hidden beneath designer labels. His wounds were mapped out on his flesh, a testament to his survival. The car hit a slight bump, a rarity on this stretch of avenue. The man groaned, his brow nodding in distress. "Lily," he muttered the word, a gravelly whisper. "Daddy's coming. Almost there, Bug." His voice lacked the honeyed polish of the men in her circle. It was raw, unrefined scraping against the silence of the luxury vehicle. But it held a grounding resonance. It anchored the floating sterile space of the Maybach to the gritty reality of the pavement outside. It was a voice that commanded nothing, yet promised everything to a child waiting in the dark. Evelyn rested her chin on her knuckles. The shark was quiet tonight. The predatory instincts that usually demanded she expel this intruder, sanitize the seat, and fire her security team lay completely dormant. Instead, a profound, heavy silence draped over her. She watched the water drip from his boot onto the floor mat. The mat cost $3,000 to replace. She found she did not care. The insignificance of money had never been so glaringly obvious to her. "Marcus," she said, pressing the intercom button. Her voice maintained its customary cool evenness, betraying none of the internal shift occurring within her. "Yes, Miss Vance. Take the scenic route past the park. Avoid the potholes on 7th Avenue. I want a smooth ride." A brief pause crackled over the line. Marcus knew her schedules. He knew her ruthlessness. A detour for a smooth ride, adding 10 minutes to her transit, was an alien command. Usually, she demanded the fastest, most efficient path, regardless of comfort. "Understood, ma'am?" Adjusting route. The Maybach banked smoothly, turning away from the direct, bumpy thoroughfare. Evelyn leaned back into the shadows of her seat. She crossed her legs, listening to the rhythmic, exhausted breathing of the man beside her. The rain continued its assault on the roof, but inside, the storm had ceased. She analyzed the dirt beneath his fingernails. She traced the frayed edges of his collar with her eyes. She, Evelyn Vance, controlled millions of dollars, commanded hundreds of employees, and dictated the flow of markets. Yet looking at the sleeping mechanic, she felt a sudden, inexplicable inadequacy. Her penthouse was a palace of glass and steel towering above the city, but it was hollow. The man sleeping next to her possessed nothing, held nothing but a paper bag and a torn toy, but he was tethered to the earth by a love so fierce it radiated from his exhausted pores. He was a king in a grease-stained coat, defending a kingdom of one. The city lights smeared across the window pane, a kaleidoscope of cold colors blurring into a river of neon. Evelyn let her eyes slide shut. For the first time in months, the endless churning calculations in her brain slowed to a halt. The phantom weight of Richard's ambition, the crushing pressure of quarterly expectations, the hollow victories, they all receded. The only thing that mattered in this encapsulated moment was the steady rise and fall of the stranger's chest, the fragile cargo he protected, and the quiet journey toward East 82nd Street. The Maybach rolled to a seamless halt. The cessation of motion acted as a silent alarm, a shift in gravity that rippled through the heavy air of the cabin. Outside the tinted windows, the manicured avenues of the financial district had bled into the fractured concrete of East 82nd Street. Here the streetlights did not gleam. They flickered, casting a sickly yellow hue over overflowing dumpsters and chain-link fences. The luxury vehicle sat parked by the curb, a pristine black monolith resting in a graveyard, a forgotten architecture. Elias stirred. A low groan scraped the back of his throat. His heavy eyelids fluttered, fighting the leaden weight of exhaustion. For a fraction of a second, his mind floated in a disorienting void. The air smelled wrong. It lacked the sharp tang of ammonia and wet wool he associated with cheap transit. Instead, a subtle, earthy trace of bergamot filled his lungs. The seat beneath him yielded with too much grace, cradling his aching spine rather than pressing into his bruises. He blinked the grit from his eyes. The shadows of the cabin materialized into focus. He registered the brushed steel accents, the glowing digital climate console, the expanse of untouched leather. Then his gaze tracked left. A woman sat opposite him. She was a study in immaculate lines and calculated stillness. A silk blouse draped over her shoulders, catching the faint street lamp glow. Her posture remained straight, unyielding, yet her dark eyes studied him with an intensity that pinned him to the seat. She did not shrink away. She simply watched. The fog of sleep evaporated. Reality crashed down cold and heavy. Elias stiffened his muscles, locking, as the magnitude of his error snapped into place. He looked down at his ruined work boots, resting on the custom floor mats, leaving a perimeter of dirty rainwater. He saw the dark, oily smudge his canvas jacket had stamped against the pristine cream upholstery of the door panel. Panic flared in his chest, hot and fast. He instinctively tightened his left arm, ensuring the pharmacy bag and the worn yarn rabbit remained secure against his ribs. They were safe. He drew a ragged breath, wrestling the panic down into a tight, manageable knot. He did not possess the luxury of falling apart. He cleared his throat. The sound was harsh, breaking the velvet silence. "I made a mistake," Elias rasped. He kept his voice low, steadying the tremor that threatened his words. "The app. It said a black car. I wasn't looking." He expected a reprimand. He braced for the sharp, entitled venom he often received from the wealthy clientele at the auto shop, the people who tossed their keys at his chest and looked right through him. He waited for the threat of police, the demand for compensation, the disgust. Evelyn offered none of it. She maintained her quiet observation, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The absence of her anger unsettled him more than a shout would have. Elias shifted his weight, pulling away from the leather, as if his very presence was corrosive. He needed to make it right. His pride, battered and worn thin by years of systemic defeat, was the only currency he truly owned. He refused to be a beggar in a billionaire's backseat. He dug his calloused, grease-stained hand into the damp pocket of his jeans. His fingers scraped against the rough denim, searching past a stray hex nut and a broken piece of chalk. He found the familiar thin roll of paper. He pulled his hand free. Under the dim ambient glow of the cabin lights, he uncurled his fist. A wad of crumpled waterlogged bills sat in his palm. Ones, a few fives, a single faded $10 bill. They were limp, softened by the rain that had soaked through his coat, their edges frayed from months of circulation, in the hands of the working class. He used his taped thumb to smooth the bills against his knee, a slow, methodical action. He flattened the creases, trying to impose order on his chaotic survival. This was tomorrow's bread. This was the electricity bill. But a debt was a debt. He extended his hand toward the space between them. The damp money rested on his scarred palm, a pathetic offering in a vehicle worth more than his life's projected earnings. "For the ride," Elias set his jaw tight. "And for the mess I made of your seat. It ain't enough to detail it, I know, but it's what I have." Evelyn looked at the extended hand. She stared at the dirt embedded deep in his knuckles, the peeling electrical tape, the raw red skin exposed to the chill. Then she looked at the money. $17 and some loose silver coins. In her world, men moved millions with a signature. They traded companies like playing cards, gambling with numbers so large they lost all tangible meaning. Yet, looking at the damp, crinkled paper in this mechanic's hand, Evelyn felt a profound, grounding weight. She recognized the sacrifice stitched into those bills. He was offering her pieces of his own survival to preserve his dignity. It was a raw, unfiltered display of honor that her corporate ecosystem had long since eradicated. She did not reach for the money. "Put it away," she instructed. Her voice was a quiet murmur, devoid of its usual boardroom frost. It held a strange, careful cadence, as if she were speaking to a wild animal she did not wish to spook. Elias kept his hand suspended. "I don't take charity, ma'am." "It isn't charity," Evelyn replied, holding his gaze. The street lamp flickered outside, casting a brief shadow across her face. "It was a navigational error on my driver's part. We took a wrong turn." She paused, her eyes dropping for a fraction of a second to the bulge in his jacket. "Keep it for Lily." Elias froze. The name hung in the air, a ghost summoned into the luxury car. A flash of profound vulnerability crossed his face, stripping away the stoic mask. He realized he must have spoken in his sleep. He felt exposed, seen in a way that left him completely defenseless. He slowly withdrew his hand, his fingers curling back over the damp bills. He tucked them into his pocket with deliberate care. He offered no further argument. Her refusal was not born of pity. It was a silent acknowledgement of his reality, a rare concession he had never experienced from someone wearing silk. He reached for the door handle. The heavy latch clicked. "Thank you." Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. He did not look back. He pushed the heavy door open, stepping out into the freezing deluge. The wind immediately swallowed him, whipping the canvas coat against his frame. He pushed the door shut, the solid thud sealing the Maybach once again. Evelyn watched through the rain-streaked glass. She tracked his silhouette as he hurried up the cracked steps of the brick building, shielding his coat against the storm. He disappeared into the dark stairwell, leaving behind a puddle of water on her floor mat, and a faint scent of rain, and an echoing silence that deafened her. Thong tin truoc kai viet. Phan dang viet pan 5. Echoes in the penthouse, so tu muk tiu 1002. The private elevator hummed a pressurized steel capsule, pulling Evelyn away from the street level. Floor indicators blinked in rapid succession. 10, 40, 80. With every passing number, the gritty reality of East 82nd Street receded, replaced by the sterile, rarefied air of the upper atmosphere. The doors slid apart with a soft chime, releasing her into the foyer of her penthouse. Silence greeted her. It was not the heavy, expectant silence of the Maybach, but a hollow, echoing vacuum. Evelyn stepped onto the imported Italian marble. Her heels clicked against the stone, a sharp metronomic rhythm that emphasized the sheer scale of the empty space. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the living room, framing a panoramic view of the skyline. Up here, the storm was merely a visual display. The reinforced glass muted the wind. The rain slid down the panes in silent, glittering streaks. She was untouchable. She was isolated. She dropped her leather briefcase onto a glass console table. The dull thud vanished into the cavernous room. "You skipped the victory dinner, Evie?" A shadow detached itself from the far corner of the room. Richard stepped into the ambient glow of the city lights. He wore a bespoke navy suit, the fabric clinging to his frame with tailored precision. A crystal tumbler rested in his right hand, amber liquid swirling around a single, perfectly spherical ice cube. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Evelyn did not flinch. She simply stared at him, registering the intrusion with a cold detachment. He possessed the security codes to her private elevator, a lingering concession from a brief strategic alliance they both pretended was a relationship. The board approved the acquisition. Richard continued taking a slow sip of his scotch. He flashed a practiced, symmetrical smile. We liquidated their assets. The stock will soar by Tuesday. We opened the 60-year Macallan to celebrate, and the queen of the hour was missing. He closed the distance between them. The scent of expensive cologne and aged liquor preceded him, a thick, cloying cloud that sought to mask the emptiness underneath. Evelyn looked at the crystal glass in his hand. Her gaze drifted to his fingers. They were immaculate. The cuticles were pushed back, the skin soft and unblemished. A platinum watch, heavy and ostentatious, rested against his wrist. These were hands that manipulated spreadsheets, hands that signed termination clauses for thousands of employees without a tremor. They were hands that had never known the sting of frostbite, the deep ache of manual labor, or the desperate need to protect a $5 bottle of medicine. A vivid image superimposed itself over Richard's polished knuckles. She saw the mechanic. She saw the dirt etched into his lifelines, the frayed electrical tape holding his flesh together, the waterlogged, crumpled dollar bills offered with a quiet, unyielding dignity. Evie. Richard frowned, the perfect symmetry of his smile faltering. He reached out, his soft fingers brushing against the silk of her sleeve. You look pale. Let me pour you a drink. You need to unwind. The contact jolted her. His touch felt weightless, devoid of any real substance. She stepped back, breaking the physical connection. The recoil was instinctual, a visceral rejection of the artificial warmth he offered. Leave the glass, Richard, Evelyn said. Her voice was flat, carrying the chill of the rain outside. And leave the apartment. Richard blinked, his ego stumbling over the direct dismissal. A flash of irritation tightened his jaw. He was accustomed to deference to women who folded themselves into his narrative. He did not know how to handle a locked door. Excuse me. He let out a dry, incredulous chuckle. I secured the votes today. I fought your battle in that boardroom while you stared at the wall. You owe me a conversation, at the very least. I owe you my signature on a dividend check. She countered, her eyes locking onto his. The shark had returned, but her teeth were bared for a different reason. We closed a deal. We destroyed a legacy company. There is no victory here, Richard. Only a transaction. Now get out. He stared at her, the mask of the charming suitor dissolving, revealing the arrogant, calculating core beneath. He set the crystal tumbler on the glass table. The heavy base struck the surface with a sharp, aggressive clack. You are losing your edge, Evelyn, he sneered, adjusting his lapels. This city eats the soft ones alive. Don't call me when the isolation starts keeping you awake. He turned on his heel, his leather shoes silent against the marble. The elevator doors opened, swallowed him whole, and slid shut, severing his presence from her sanctuary. Evelyn stood alone in the center of the vast room. The air felt cleaner, yet the oppressive emptiness remained. She walked toward the expansive windows, resting her forehead against the cool, reinforced glass. Down below, the city was a labyrinth of glowing arteries, a chaotic mesh of millions of lives grinding against each other. Somewhere in that tangled grid, a man in a damp canvas coat was sitting in a drafty apartment. He was pouring pink syrup into a plastic spoon. He was placing a ragged yarn rabbit next to a sleeping child. She closed her eyes. The memory of the Maybach's interior rushed back to her. She could still smell the faint, lingering odor of engine grease. She could still see the muddy footprint staining her pristine floor mat. It was an imperfection. It was a flaw in her carefully curated existence. Yet as she stood surrounded by millions of dollars of cold stone and untouchable art, that muddy footprint felt like the only real thing she had encountered in years. It was an anchor dropped into a sea of artificiality. Evelyn pulled her phone from her pocket. She did not check her email. She did not review the fluctuating market numbers. She opened the secure messaging app connecting her to her security detail. Her thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard, her mind replaying the gravelly, exhausted voice reciting a destination. Find the auto repair shops within a 10-block radius of East 82nd Street. She typed the blue light of the screen illuminating her determined features. I need a name. She pressed send. The message vanished into the ether. She turned away from the glass, leaving the sweeping view of the city behind. The penthouse was a fortress, but tonight, Evelyn Vance was preparing to tear down the walls. She needed to find the source of the grease and the crumpled bills. She needed to understand the gravity that held that man to the earth. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement of 10th Avenue, baking the stagnant puddles left behind by the storm. Sal's Auto Repair sat wedged between a defunct textile mill and a chain-link fence, an open-air cavern of concrete and corrugated metal. The air inside the garage was thick-heavy with the scent of oxidized iron, burnt rubber, and raw petroleum. Pneumatic drills whined a deafening mechanical chorus punctuated by the sharp clang of metal striking metal. A shadow drifted across the sunlit entrance. The low rumbling purr of the Maybach silenced the nearest mechanics. The sleek midnight black chassis glided over the uneven asphalt, rolling to a deliberate stop inches from the oil-stained boundary of the shop floor. It was an alien vessel touching down on hostile terrain. The rear door swung open. Evelyn stepped into the brutal afternoon heat. She wore a tailored ivory trench coat over a pale silk blouse, paired with wide-legged trousers that flowed around her ankles like liquid smoke. Her heels clicked against the grit, a sharp, precise sound that cut through the low murmur of the gathered mechanics. Men in dark, heavy coveralls paused with wrenches suspended midair. They stared, caught between intimidation and sheer confusion. She belonged behind the tinted glass of a penthouse suite, not breathing the metallic dust of Bay 4. She ignored the audience. Her gaze swept the cavernous space, slicing through the hazy exhaust fumes. She found him beneath the elevated chassis of a rusted sedan. Elias lay flat on a wooden creeper, his broad shoulders wedged under the decaying frame of the vehicle. A heavy torque wrench gripped in his right hand wrestled with a seized bolt. Grease painted thick, dark streaks across his forearms, blending into the faded ink of an old military tattoo. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the harsh glare of a bare utility bulb dangling nearby. He applied a final brutal surge of pressure. The metal groaned and gave way. Elias exhaled a long, measured breath, the tension leaving his coiled muscles. He pushed off the floor with his boot rolling out from beneath the undercarriage. He sat up, reaching for a shop rag draped over a toolbox. He wiped the worst of the sludge from his knuckles, the rough fabric doing little to remove the embedded stains. Then he looked up. The rag stalled in his hands. His posture shifted instantly. The relaxed exhaustion of a completed task vanished, replaced by a rigid, guarded tension. He recognized the woman. He recognized the cold, unyielding lines of her profile and the immaculate ivory coat that seemed to repel the surrounding dirt. He stood. He wiped his hands one last time, a futile gesture of presentability, and tossed the rag onto the workbench. "You lost, ma'am." A burly mechanic near the entrance called out, wiping his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. Evelyn did not break eye contact with Elias. She bypassed the man entirely, her heels navigating the labyrinth of discarded tires, spilled antifreeze, and tangled air hoses with unerring precision. She walked straight toward Bay 4. As she closed the distance, a sound drifted from the corner of Elias's workspace. A dry, rattling cough. Evelyn stopped. Her eyes shifted past the towering frame of the mechanic. Tucked into a small alcove formed by stacks of new winter tires, a makeshift bed of clean packing blankets lay spread over a wooden pallet. A little girl sat cross-legged in the center. She was tiny, swallowed by an oversized gray hoodie that belonged to her father. A box of broken crayons rested by her knee. In her lap sat the grotesque frayed yarn rabbit, its one good button eye staring blankly at the ceiling. Lily hacked into the crook of her elbow, her small shoulders shaking with the effort. Elias moved. He intercepted Evelyn's path, placing his body squarely between the millionaire and his daughter. It was not a hostile maneuver, but a definitive drawing of a boundary. The grease on his coveralls smeared the air between them. "I told you." Elias kept his voice low, a gravelly rumble meant only for her. I don't take charity. If you came to give the money back or bill me for the leather, you're wasting your time. I'm working. Evelyn studied the harsh defensive lines of his jaw. The exhaustion from the previous night remained etched into his features, compounded by half a day of grueling labor. Yet his chin was raised, his spine locked in quiet defiance. I didn't come for an apology, Evelyn replied, the cadence of her voice softer than it had been in years. And I didn't come to collect a debt. She stepped to the side, bypassing his blockade. Elias tensed a muscle feathering in his cheek, but he did not grab her. He watched an unsettled energy radiating from his core as she approached the pallet. Lily looked up. Her large, fever-bright eyes widened. The woman standing before her looked like a character pulled from the glossy pages of a magazine, a creature woven from light and expensive fabrics. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the blanket. She looked at the grimy concrete floor. She looked at the pristine ivory hem of her trousers. Then she bent her knees. Elias drew a sharp breath. The Millionaire CEO lowered herself onto the dusty, oil-flecked pavement, sitting directly across from the child. The ivory fabric pooled over the stained concrete, soaking up a faint smudge of dark gray soot. She did not flinch. She did not brush it away. "Hello," Evelyn said. The single word felt foreign on her tongue, stripped of its usual commanding weight. It was fragile. Lily blinked, pulling the yarn rabbit closer to her chest. She looked past Evelyn, seeking her father's face for permission. Elias gave a slow, hesitant nod, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coveralls. "I'm Lily," the girl whispered, her voice carrying the rasp of the fading sickness. "Are you a princess?" A genuine, unpracticed smile broke across Evelyn's face. The ice cracked, shattering the final remnants of her corporate armor. The smile transformed her, softening the sharp angles of her cheekbones and bringing a dormant warmth to her dark eyes. "No," Evelyn murmured, reaching out a manicured hand to gently touch the floppy ear of the rabbit. "I just wear nice coats to hide the fact that I'm tired. I see you brought a friend." "This is Barnaby," Lily offered, pushing the doll slightly forward. "He guards the fort while Daddy fixes the cars." Evelyn traced the frayed pink yarn. She felt the uneven stitching, the lopsided weight of the toy. It was the most valuable asset she had touched all week. She looked up from the child, her gaze finding Elias. He stood near the toolbox, watching them with an intensity that bordered on painful. The defensive wall had crumbled, leaving behind a raw, unfiltered vulnerability. He was a man accustomed to the world looking down on him, judging the dirt beneath his nails and the frayed edges of his collar. He expected disgust. He expected pity. Instead, he saw a woman draped in silk, sitting in the dust of his reality, speaking to his daughter as if she were the only person in the room. Evelyn held his gaze. In the sterile quiet of her penthouse, she had commanded an empire. But here, amidst the deafening roar of the air compressors and the suffocating smell of exhaust, she found something infinitely more powerful. She found a king who built his castle from spare parts and sacrifice. And for the first time in her meticulously calculated life, she wanted to step inside. The fragile piece resting over Bay 4 fractured. A silver sports car tore through the open gates, its engine emitting a high-pitched entitled whine that drowned out the rhythmic clatter of the pneumatic tools. It parked at a severe angle, blocking 2 customer vehicles. The door swung open. Richard stepped onto the oil-stained concrete. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, the fabric cut sharp enough to draw blood. His gaze swept the garage, his upper lip curling as the scent of burnt rubber and cheap coffee reached him. He looked entirely out of place. A sterile surgical instrument dropped into a mud puddle. He spotted the ivory coat. His eyes narrowed, tracking the expensive fabric down to where it pooled against the filthy floor. He saw Evelyn. He saw the child. He saw the mechanic standing guard. "Evie?" Richard's voice sliced through the ambient noise of the shop. It carried the polished carrying timbre of a man accustomed to silencing boardrooms. Evelyn's spine stiffened. The genuine warmth that had softened her features vanished, replaced instantly by the familiar freezing mask of the CEO. She did not scramble to her feet. She rose with deliberate slowness, brushing a streak of black soot from her silk trousers. Elias stepped forward. The shift in his posture was microscopic, but absolute. The tired, hesitant father receded. The man who replaced him carried the silent, dangerous gravity of a soldier assessing a threat. He wiped a dollop of grease from his thumb with a shop rag, his eyes locking onto the intruder. Richard marched past a rack of tires, ignoring the mechanic completely. He stopped 2 feet from Evelyn, his jaw tight with barely contained indignation. "I tracked your phone," Richard stated, smoothing his silk tie. "When security said you took the Maybach to 10th Avenue, I assumed it was a mistake. Are we doing charity work now? Handing out alms to the local grease monkeys?" He cast a dismissive glance toward the wooden pallet. Lily shrank back, pulling the oversized hood over her head, her small fingers burying themselves in the yarn rabbit. A muscle flickered in Elias's jaw. He tossed the stained rag onto a nearby oil drum. The dull slap of the fabric echoed in the tense space. "The exit is exactly where you left it," Elias said. His tone held no heat. It was flat, carrying the cold resonance of an anvil. Richard blinked, genuinely surprised that the hired help possessed a voice. He turned his attention to Elias, looking him up and down. He took in the faded, oil-soaked coveralls, the scuffed boots, the dark grime wedged deep beneath his fingernails. A patronizing smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I'm speaking to my partner," Richard drawled, emphasizing the word. He reached inside his jacket, pulling out a slim platinum money clip. "If you need compensation for the interruption, tell me your hourly rate. I'll buy your entire week, and you can take the kids somewhere that doesn't smell like a toxic waste dump." He peeled a crisp $100 bill from the stack and held it out. The paper fluttered slightly in the draft of the garage. Evelyn opened her mouth to intervene, the ice in her veins turning into pure venom, but Elias raised a single calloused hand. The gesture was small, yet it commanded total silence. Elias did not look at the money. He looked at Richard's manicured fingers. He looked at the flawless crease of his trousers. "Put your wallet away," Elias instructed, his voice dropping an octave. "You don't carry enough currency to buy a second of my time." Richard let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "Pride. It's always the ones with nothing who cling to pride." "Look around you, man. You're raising a child in a garage. You let her sleep on packing blankets. You think your pride keeps her warm." The words hit their mark. They were precision strikes aimed at the deepest, most agonizing insecurities of a single father. Elias felt the familiar crushing weight of his reality pressed down on his chest. He knew the pallet was hard. He knew the air was foul. He took a slow, measured step toward the executive. Richard held his ground, but a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. Elias stood 3 inches taller, his shoulders broadened by years of lifting engine blocks and carrying the weight of the world. The mechanic did not puff out his chest. He did not raise his fists. He simply closed the distance, bringing the raw metallic scent of his labor directly into Richard's personal space. "I build things," Elias said, the gravel in his voice grating against the quiet. "I take broken, discarded metal and I make it run. I know the value of every bolt, every spark, every drop of oil." He tilted his head, his dark eyes boring into Richard's. "You tear things apart. You sit in glass towers and trade paper pretending it makes you a king, but strip away the suit, the watch, and that clip in your hand." Elias leaned in, his voice a devastating whisper. "And there is nothing left. You are an empty chassis. You make a lot of noise, but you have no engine." Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. The sophisticated veneer cracked, exposing the fragile ego underneath. He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of insults, to crush this laborer with the full weight of his financial superiority. Elias did not give him the chance. "Do not disrespect my daughter." Elias continued the quiet command in his tone, offering zero room for negotiation. "Do not disrespect my shop. and do not ever point your money at me again. Now turn around, get back in your toy car and drive." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The background noise of the garage seemed to fade into a distant hum. Evelyn watched the exchange, her breath caught in her throat. She had spent a decade surrounded by apex predators, men who ripped each other apart in boardrooms over fractions of a percent. She had witnessed countless displays of dominance. But she had never seen anything like this. Elias had not raised his voice. He had not thrown a punch. He had simply dismantled Richard's entire existence, using nothing but the unyielding truth of his own integrity. He protected his ground, not with aggression, but with an insurmountable, quiet dignity. Richard stood paralyzed. The $100 bill still hung limply from his fingers. The devastating accuracy of the mechanic's words had stripped him bare in front of Evelyn. He looked at her, searching for an ally, searching for the familiar, ruthless partner who would put this grease-stained peasant in his place. He found only a stranger. Evelyn was looking at Elias. Her dark eyes, usually guarded and calculating, were wide, reflecting a profound, unmistakable reverence. The silver sports car waiting in the driveway now looked incredibly small. Richard stared at Evelyn, the crisp bill trembling ever so slightly in his grip. He waited for her to bridge the gap, to align herself with the familiar comfort of wealth and status. He expected the ruthless executive who had spent the last decade carving out a kingdom of glass and steel to put the laborer in his place. Evelyn moved. She did not walk toward the silver sports car. She took one deliberate step, placing herself shoulder to shoulder with the mechanic in the oil-stained coveralls. The ivory silk of her sleeve brushed against the rough, darkened canvas of Elias's arm. The contrast was stark, a visual collision of two entirely separate universes. Yet they stood anchored to the same patch of concrete. "Fold the money, Richard," Evelyn instructed. Her tone carried no heat, no elevated pitch. It was an Arctic breeze freezing the air between them. "Put it back in your pocket, and then leave." Richard blinked, a shallow laugh escaping his lips. "Are you out of your mind? You are throwing away a merger over a man who charges by the hour to tighten bolts." "I am excising a liability," Evelyn corrected, her gaze dissecting him with surgical precision. "You equate net worth with human value. You walk into a place of honest labor and wave loose change like a master feeding stray dogs. It is embarrassing. It reveals exactly how hollow you are." The color drained from Richard's face. The mechanics in the surrounding bays had stopped pretending to work. They stood in silent witness wrenches, hanging loose in their grips, watching the corporate titan wither under the steady, unblinking judgment of his own partner. "I secured the board votes." Richard gritted his teeth, wielding his only remaining weapon. "You sever our ties, you lose the expansion. You lose the majority." "Keep it," Evelyn said. The words lacked any trace of hesitation. "I will have my legal team draft the dissolution papers by morning. Do not call my private line. Do not use my elevator." Richard stood stranded in the middle of Bay 4. The armor of his bespoke suit offered no protection against the profound public humiliation. He looked at Elias, searching for a target to project his failure upon, but the mechanic merely watched him, an immovable stone wall of quiet authority. Richard spun on his heel, the leather of his shoes scraping against the grit. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his sports car. The engine roared, an aggressive hollow scream that echoed off the corrugated metal roof as he reversed blindly and tore out into the street. The scent of burnt rubber lingered, a foul reminder of his exit. Then the garage was quiet again. The distant hum of the city filtered back in. Elias exhaled a long, ragged breath that deflated the aggressive tension in his broad shoulders. He wiped a hand across his jaw, leaving a fresh streak of grease near his chin. He turned his head, looking down at the woman standing beside him. "That was an expensive conversation," Elias murmured, the gravel in his voice softening. "It was the cheapest lesson I have ever bought," Evelyn replied. She looked down at the hem of her ivory coat, now permanently marked by the soot of his world. She ran a manicured thumb over the stain, finding a strange comfort in the ruined fabric. It was proof that she had stepped off her pedestal and touched solid ground. A soft rustle drew their attention. Lily shifted on the wooden pallet, pulling the oversized hood away from her face. The feverish flush had receded slightly, her eyes clear as she clutched the yarn rabbit to her chest. Elias bypassed the Millionaire CEO and dropped to his knees beside the packing blankets. He pressed the back of his hand against his daughter's forehead, his rough, scarred fingers moving with infinite care. "Temperature is down, Bug," he whispered, a tight, relieved smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You did good holding the fort." Evelyn approached, moving with a quiet reverence. She did not hover. She found a discarded, overturned plastic bucket nearby and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She watched the father and daughter, a tight, impenetrable unit forged in the fires of survival. The afternoon stretched into evening. The harsh glare of the sun mellowed into a bruised golden dusk, casting long shadows across the garage floor. Evelyn did not check her watch. She did not answer the silent, vibrating demands of her phone. She simply sat, breathing in the scent of motor oil and rust, waiting while Elias finished his shift. When the foreman finally blew the whistle, Elias wiped down his tools with methodical precision. He scooped Lily into his arms, wrapping her securely in his canvas jacket, nestling her against the steady rhythm of his heart. Outside, the Maybach waited, an island of luxury parked in the grit. Marcus, the driver, stood holding the rear door open. This time, Elias did not stumble into the dark cabin blindly. He stepped in with his eyes open, fully aware of the space he occupied. Evelyn slid in beside them. The heavy doors sealed shut, locking out the noise of 10th Avenue. The air inside the car was calm. The barrier that had existed the night before, woven from exhaustion, misunderstanding, and immense social disparity, had evaporated. Lily rested her head against her father's collarbone, her breathing slow and even, drifting into sleep. Elias leaned his head back against the headrest, looking sideways at the woman who had traded an empire for a stained coat. "I have an hour before I have to put her to bed," Elias said quietly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cabin. He hesitated, tracing the frayed ear of the yarn rabbit with his thumb. "I can't offer you a 60-year scotch. But there is a diner on the corner of 82nd. They pour a decent cup of coffee. It's warm." It was an invitation across the divide. It was a king opening the gates of his meager, fiercely guarded castle. Evelyn looked at his battered hands, at the honest, weary lines of his face. She thought of the penthouse, of the cold marble, and the suffocating silence waiting for her at the top of the city. "Coffee sounds perfect," Evelyn said. A genuine, unguarded smile reached her eyes. The Maybach pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly into the flow of traffic. The neon lights smeared across the tinted glass, painting the cabin in fleeting warm colors. They rode in silence, but it was no longer the heavy, cautious silence of strangers. It was a shared quiet, a foundation being laid brick by brick, deep in the earth, far below the reach of the glass towers. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Quiet Dad Stories. Tonight's journey took us far beyond the tinted glass of a Maybach and deep into the core of what it means to truly provide. We watched a man strip away a corporate titan's artificial armor using nothing but the raw truth of his own sacrifices. Elias proved that real power does not live in boardrooms or bank accounts. It resides in the calloused hands of a father building a safe haven for his little girl out of spare parts and pure devotion. I want to ask you something. When the millionaire waved that $100 bill attempting to purchase a laborer's dignity, Elias chose a quiet, devastating restraint over aggression. Have you ever faced a moment where holding your ground required more strength than throwing a punch? Do you believe true pride is refusing to let the world assign a price tag to your honor? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If this collision of worlds resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Tap the bell icon and join our community for more tales of unspoken sacrifices, fierce love, and hard-earned vindication. Until we meet again, value the dust on your boots, protect your peace, and keep the people who matter most close to your heart. Good night.